Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. My name is Lisa Hazeldine and I am the Spectator's assistant online editor. The war in Ukraine has once again entered the election campaign narrative here in Britain. Nigel Farage made some controversial comments over the war earlier this week, where he stated that it was in fact the West and NATO in particular that had provoked Putin into invading Ukraine 2 years ago. Today, to discuss these comments and the role of NATO are Glenn Diesen and Sergey Radchenko. Thank you both for joining me. Glenn, Farage's comments seem to have opened up a split on the right side of British politics. What do you make of his comments?
Well, in my opinion, this should be common sense. The former British ambassador to Moscow, Roderick Lyne, he argued in 2020 that it was a mistake to try to get Ukraine into NATO. And in his words, if you want to start a war with Russia, this would be the best way of doing it. Angela Merkel also warned that NATO expansion to Ukraine would be interpreted by Moscow as a declaration of war. This is very similar to what the CIA director William Burns argued, in which he predicted that if NATO would try to pull in Ukraine, it would likely trigger a Russian invasion. And he added that this is something that the Russians wouldn't want to do. So I think that overall it's quite clear that Russia reacted to what would be NATO provocations. I mean, even anti-Russian hawks like Ambassador Michael McFaul recognized that Russia only seized Crimea in response to the West backing the toppling of Yanukovych. So I think it's also quite clear from the actual peace negotiations that began. Keep in mind that the day after Russia invaded, Zelensky already confirmed that they had been contacted by the Russians, in which they started in the Istanbul process of pursuing a peace. And as everyone has agreed, the main component of this peace negotiation was organized around the idea of restoring Ukraine's neutrality. This has been confirmed by the Ukrainian sides, by the mediators. So for me, it seems very uncontroversial to point out the fact that this was a provocation, that Russia reacted to the threat of NATO expansion, which it deems to be an existential threat.
And Sergey, what do you think of Farage's comments? Were they provocative? What do you think the impact of his comments will be?
Well, I don't think the impact is going to be very far-reaching. And basically, Farage has reproduced Putin's talking points when it comes to the question of the invasion of Ukraine. Blaming the West, this is not something that is new. You know, we know that Putin has repeatedly done so. I mean, my problem with what just Glenn has just described here is that we sort of assume that Russia is some kind of a beast. You poke a beast with a stick and it'll bite back at you. In reality, if you go back to 2022, the time of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I mean, I was actually in Moscow in the run-up to the invasion, and the foreign policy community, the experts, nobody had any inkling that it was going to come. And in fact, if you were to ask them, do you think it's a good idea? Everybody would say, no, that's an extremely bad idea. Indeed, we know that some of people around Putin, people like Lavrov, for example, were fairly, unenthusiastic about this. Putin himself criticized Naryshkin for being kind of lukewarm on the whole idea of invasion. Invasion was Putin's idea, and we have to be very clear about it. Russia faced a variety of options in 2022. It could have negotiated with the West. It could have done. It could have pursued its own development and made life better for its own people. And yet we see this invasion. It's almost a mechanical response to NATO. I mean, another thing to remember: Ukraine was not on its way to NATO in 2022. Yes, Bucharest's declaration proclaims this was some sort of future aspiration, but even today, as we can see, nobody is actually offering Ukraine a place in NATO. They're saying yes, it will get there eventually. In reality, of course, we know that in particular the United States and Germany are not very keen to see Ukraine in NATO. So the threat is certainly overblown. We're talking about Putin's perceptions of threats, right? You can have a different kind of perception, and you could have perceived NATO in a very different light, as many Russian intellectuals and policy experts did in 2022. But it's only this specific perception that Putin had that is very violent, very black and white, that indeed led to the Russian invasion. And now blaming this on the West, I think, of course, Putin does that. He has to justify his invasion, but I don't think we should do that here. And when Farage does that, I think he ignores the complexity of this question and just is trying to really simplify this narrative for people who vote for him, who don't know any better, frankly.
This question of Putin's agency, his choice to go to war, as you've described it in the piece you wrote for us yesterday on Coffee House, Sergey, is a really interesting one, because I think it really gets to the nub of how this war came about. So I was just wondering, Glenn, in terms of this idea that Putin was provoked into going to war in Ukraine, even if in the West the narrative is viewed differently and that it was a choice that Putin made to go to war, do you nevertheless think that there's something helpful to understanding Putin's way of thinking that might help bring an end to this conflict?
Well, I wouldn't deny that Putin has agency. And I also wouldn't put all the blame on the West either. But I'm saying that there's been two sides in this, and I think NATO's role in provoking it has been ignored. Because in NATO, what we did is we presented the Russians with a dilemma. That is, Russia can either accept NATO's growing presence in Ukraine, which Russia considers to be an existential threat, or they could use military force to remove that threat. Now, obviously, NATO is responsible for posing this dilemma to the Russians, which was the provocation, and Russia's responsible for the choice it made. I'm not sure if there was any more possibilities of negotiations. I remember negotiations occurring through 2021, and I also remember that the West was willing to give nothing in terms of security guarantees for the Russians. That being said, I think they should have continued to try to negotiate, so I don't disagree with this aspect. But it's not an issue of being either in NATO or outside. There's an incrementalism which NATO always pursues, whether it's about expansion, missile defense, or now in Ukraine. And it's a gradual process of making Ukraine a de facto member. And I think this is what you saw, especially then intensifying through 2021, when it began to modernize its ports to fit US warships. Also, I would point attention to the November 2021 US-Ukraine Charter on Strategic Partnership, which was to arm Ukraine further for the purpose of what they refer to as reintegrating Crimea, which would be an attack on Russia. Now, this is not even my words. The advisor of former French President Sarkozy, he argued that this agreement between between the Ukrainians and the Americans in November of 2021, it convinced the Russians they either had to attack or be attacked. And this was a similar argument of the former chief of Russia analysis at the CIA, George Beebe, who made the argument in December of 21 that the Americans were entrenching themselves more and more in Ukraine, to the point that if Russia didn't do anything now in terms of an invasion, they might lose that possibility, as the Americans would only strengthen their position and Ukraine becoming a de facto NATO member, which again the Russians deem to be an existential threat. So I think two things can be correct. Putin has agency, but definitely NATO provoked this war.
When we talk about we talk about the Russians. There are many Russians. Are we talking about Putin? And if we're talking specifically about Putin and not the abstract Russians, then let's see about what Putin actually says about his reasons for invading Ukraine. And if you read his various articles, one of the things that he says there that is very prominent is the idea that Ukraine is actually part of Russia and has always been. And this actually has nothing to do with NATO, right? So simplifying this and saying, well, we provoked him into invading Ukraine, I think ignores the more fundamental reasons for his action. Now, I'm not saying that we should adopt a monocausal explanation and say, well, because Putin is an imperialist, therefore he invaded Ukraine, because of course he could have also invaded somebody else. But I think it would be wise to consider that his perceptions of NATO, alongside his imperialism and a variety of other factors, the fact that he perceived American weakness post-Afghanistan and so on and so forth, is what motivated. I don't think there's actually any disagreement about this. There's actually consensus position among most people, except for Nigel Farage, perhaps. But then there's this question of what the West West's responsibility actually is, right? It is as if, of course, the West exists. It certainly pursues its own policy. Eastern Europe wanted to be part of NATO. It is not like America came there and imposed itself on Eastern Europe. They were desperate to get into NATO. Those factors exist, and we can say, well, we can blame, therefore, the West and NATO and Eastern Europe for behaving the way that they do. But if you sort of weigh blame between Russia and the West for this situation, what is the West equally responsible? That is my question. Is the West mostly responsible? Is it equally responsible? Is it maybe 1% responsible? If we go beyond generalization, that the West is supposedly responsible, okay, maybe it takes two hands to clap. Maybe the West does, as in long term, over a 30-year period or something like that, could have pursued a different policy. But when we come to this actual invasion that was made by Putin, the decision that was made by Putin in February 2022, we have to deal with this person who's decided to send an army, despite the fact that many other Russians would have thought, this is crazy, put somebody else in Putin's place. Will we still have invasion? Probably not. So if we're now talking about pinning the blame on somebody, why not pin it on Putin? And why then blame the West? Yeah. And to what extent? To what extent? 1%, 50%, 100%? That's my question to Farage, for example.
So this idea of NATO expansion is a very interesting one that I'd like to unpack a little further, because there was never any codified agreement. Nothing was written down or signed by either the West and NATO or the Soviet Union that promised that NATO wouldn't continue expanding its borders eastwards. So Glenn, what do you make of that argument then? Is this a bit of a myth about NATO expansion, or is it nevertheless helpful to understand Putin's thinking behind this in terms of seeking a resolution for the war?
Well, I just want to say I would contest some of this narrative. Yes, I think the Baltic states, Poland, all these countries, they, as you said, desperately wanted to join NATO. But we already know that the Ukraine did not. From 1991 to 2014, pretty much every single poll demonstrated that the Ukrainians overwhelmingly did not want to join NATO. Even after Russia took Crimea, the Americans did polling, and they found out still only a small minority of Ukrainians wanted to join NATO. So to say that but also say that there's a principle in the international system that states should join whatever military blocs they want. I also don't think this is something that exists. I think countries like Mexico, they have freedom to join any trading bloc or have any foreign relations which they want, but certainly they don't have the freedom to join a Russian or a Chinese military alliance. If they did, and if Russian military hardware will begin to pop up on the border of the United States, the US will no longer speak of this right to join military alliances. We know from a fact that even in the Pacific, when you have countries like Solomon Islands even setting up a military partnership with China, the United States reacts very negatively.
I contest this last point. So in order to have it more of a conversation, I agree that the United States sometimes reacts very negatively to the appearance of foreign military bases in territories that are next to it. And the key case study here is Cuba. In 1961, after the Cuban Revolution, the Americans tried to effectively overthrow Castro's regime and sponsored an invasion of the island in April 1961. Right. However, if we look since then, in 1962, President Kennedy promised not to invade Cuba. And although this promise was not actually codified in any international agreement, the United States has not invaded Cuba, despite the fact that for much of the Cold War, until the end of the Cold War, really, Cuba was a Soviet ally and would host Soviet military equipment and Soviet troops. Therefore, this idea that, Russia is unexceptional in invading its neighboring countries because they flirt with foreign alliances, I think this idea is not supported by the evidence, frankly.
No, well, the point of departure in the international security is the security competition. That is because the international system is defined by the international anarchy, in which the states compete for security. If one side increases its security, it comes at the expense of another. Now, because of this, the main reason that there has never been this argument before that the recipe for peace is simply for military alliances to expand without the consideration of other great powers. And I can't imagine, as I said before, that the United States would ever accept Mexico allowing its territory to be used for the Chinese or the Russian military. And before I wanted to comment on one thing you said, which was there's no documents prohibiting NATO expansion. And often this is a reference to the fact that Gorbachev didn't get any written assurances. However, after the Cold War was declared over in 1989, in 1990, we did sign the Charter of Paris for a New Europe with the Russians. And this was very specific, that the New Europe would have no dividing lines and it would be based on indivisible security. This was also what laid the foundation for the OSCE. When NATO began to expand, it effectively violated all of these agreements for pan-European security, because now we are redividing Europe and we are increasing NATO security at the expense of Russia. So I think this NATO expansion has always been well aware that this would have undermined the security of the Russians, and this would be provocative. And again, even in the 1990s, this was not controversial at all.
So if I may, I agree in part, and Glenn, I think you're right to draw attention to the principle of indivisible security that is contained in the Paris Charter, but also in the OSCE documents. If we go back to Istanbul documents and various other documents of the OSCE that have been published over the years, if you go into those documents, there are two principles that are actually sometimes listed side by side. One is in the principle of indivisible security, which is the ones that the Russians have always been emphasizing. The other is the principle that any country has the right to join whatever alliances it wants. And those both of those principles are there. And the only reason that they could coexist without contradicting each other is that we experienced the end of the Cold War, and it seemed that alliances would not actually be perceived as threatening. However, if you actually go, approach those positions from from today's perspective, you'll see that the two principles are completely incompatible, right? You cannot, Russia can say, well, if any country joins NATO, that violates the principle of indivisible security. But the other side can say, well, excuse me, but the principle of joining whatever alliances is actually right there in the document, and both sides can be right.
Yeah, I just want to add, I agree about this contradiction, and I think this is where some of the conflicts derive from, that we have these two principles. One, countries should be able to choose what institutions they want to join, but two, we have to have an international system based on indivisible security. And I think this can also be solved in a different way. That is, that Russia could not prohibit Ukraine from joining NATO, but NATO had the option, according to these agreements, not to offer membership to Ukraine.
We can't talk about NATO's role in sort of managing foreign affairs at the moment without talking about the transition of leadership in NATO. And earlier this morning, the news was announced that Mark Rutte, the outgoing Dutch Prime Minister, will be taking over from Jens Stoltenberg in October, I believe. So I was just wondering, Sergey, what do you think of this appointment of Mark Rutte? What direction do you think he's going to take NATO in when it comes to dealing with Russia and the war in Ukraine?
Right. I think it's a reasonable appointment. I mean, look, there was a lot of criticism of Mark Rutte on the account of the Netherlands not meeting the 2% threshold for expenditures on defense. And so he was seen for that reason as something of a soft choice compared, of course, to somebody from, Eastern Europe, where people are much more focused on the Russian threat, and in their rhetoric, at least, appear much more militant. But I think the fact that Rutte was the one who was ultimately selected for this position suggests, it's almost like a signal. You could interpret it as a signal to the Russians saying, look, there are no crazies here, so to speak. We do not want a nuclear war with Russia. We want to come to some kind of a conclusion of this war in Ukraine on reasonable conditions. I'm not quite saying that this is what is being, but I'm saying that this could be an implied message here. In other words, I see Mark Rutte as a relatively reasonable person in terms of leading NATO into this new era.
Well, I agree that it's probably better than to have one of the Baltic leaders or Poland, where there's much more animosity in the relationship with the Russians. But I don't think it really matters that much in terms of who has this role as the Secretary General of NATO, as the decisions will largely be taken in Washington. Indeed, if you follow the Dutch media, they've been very explicit over the past few months in terms of how he was lobbying for this job. This is why the Netherlands, which is confirmed by Dutch media, this is why the Netherlands joined in on bombing Yemen. This is why Netherlands has been extremely pro-Israeli in this conflict and also very hawkish on Russia. This is how they were able to also win favor in Washington. So I think this is what made him electable, if you will. So, but beyond that, I don't think it matters that much who holds the position. But beyond that, I agree. For the optics, it's probably better than to have, for example, again, one of the Baltic leaders, such as, for example, Kallas in Estonia, who called for breaking up Russia in small pieces, or the president of Poland, who recently at this peace summit also called for dismembering Russia and breaking it into 200 ethnic states. So obviously, the Dutch selection is better than this in terms of trying to improve ties with Russia in the long run.
Sergey Radchenko and Glenn Diesen, thank you both very much for joining us on Spectator TV to discuss this.